of time, I'm going to get started.
I can't hear you.
Welcome to our urgent rooftop solar energy policy webinar. I want to thank our sponsor, Futures Unbound Foundation. Few quick housekeeping items. If you're having difficulty with Zoom, you can text READ at 808-345-1700. You can post questions by entering them in the chat Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Questions will be read at the very end after the speakers of all three speakers. I'll read questions and then we'll have a sort of a panel discussion with speakers. Feel free to use the regular chat, which you get to by clicking on the three buttons in the more on the right-hand side of the control bar. And feel free to use that for networking, but questions will only be answered if you put them in the Q&A chat, which is what I'll be reading from. And if you want to post your name and affiliation in the chat to network with other members of the community, we encourage you to do that. Without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, Ali Detrio, who's the Chief Strategist for Reimagine Power. Ali works on microgrids and sustainable energy policy. She's an advocate for community energy resilience and reimagined power systems centered on decentralization and democratization. She was previously the manager of policy and strategy at Energy, which is a major energy company. In 2018, she was awarded by CSSA for her leadership for critical microgrid and storage legislation that was passed. She has over 13 years experience working in clean energy and sustainability. And she'll be telling us about debunking the bogus cost shift story. So Ali, you should be able to take over and show your slides now.
Great, thanks so much, Jose. Let's see if I can.
I don't think I have to give up this.
Got it. Can everyone see my screen? You good?
I do, yes.
I see your screen, Molly.
All right, excellent. Thanks so much. And thanks so much for the Center for Community Energy for having me speak today. And thanks to all of you that are joining the webinar today. As Jose mentioned, I'm Ali Detrio. I'm the Chief Strategist for Reimagine Power. Reimagine Power is a boutique consulting firm specializing in microgrids, advanced energy technology policy, as well as resiliency and sustainability. We're based in San Francisco, and we work with a variety of different clients on microgrid policy and distributed energy policy initiatives. So I'm going to give the answer to the question of this webinar at the very beginning, and what we need to do to really realize a reimagine here in California that's focused on community energy, resilience, and true sustainability. In short term, we need to defeat AB 1139 in the legislature. This is a bill that you've probably all heard a lot about. It is actually going up potentially for reconsideration of a vote today in the Assembly. We're really hoping that we actually achieve this short-term goal today. In the medium term, what we really need to do is secure just transition towards more favorable price signals for solar and storage and microgrids at the Public Utilities Commission to make sure that we do have a thriving community energy system for all of us in California. And in long term, what we really need in California is to change the utility business model so that we can stop having all of these conversations about cost shifting and whether or not a decentralized clean energy future is what is needed. Just to talk about cost shifting a little bit more, there's been a lot of discussion about how lots of costs from rooftop solar and other clean energy technologies like microgrids or other advanced energy systems are shifting costs onto those that don't have them. And I really wanted to just remind folks of the folks that are saying these, making these types of arguments conveniently forget about all of the wildfires and the utility bankruptcy that we just went through. Wildfire victims haven't even been paid their claims yet. In fact, most of the fees that have been paid out thus far from this bankruptcy fund have gone to lawyers that are charging exorbitant rates to consult the utilities on getting out of their bankruptcy and restructuring the company. Ratepayers are paying $10.5 billion into a wildfire fund that the utilities now get to access as a means to stabilize their financial situation, which is all being funded by us. And unfortunately, we got no justice for any of this in Sacramento with any DER or resiliency policy, because the pandemic of 2020 disrupted the legislative session. And at the end of 2019, as PG&E was getting ready to emerge from bankruptcy, we had all the momentum. There was a lot of public safety power shutoffs happening. There was a ton of wildfire concerns, and the utility was getting out of bankruptcy. And we were supposed to have 2020 was supposed to be our year. The pandemic happened, and unfortunately, PG&E emerged from bankruptcy basically unpunished. And that is an injustice that we need to resolve still to this day. Another thing that's not talked about in the whole debate over cost shifting is the transmission costs. The CPUC issued a report earlier this year on an en banc on energy costs and found that transmission infrastructure costs are increasing at alarming rates. We are talking about staggering expenditures and the fact that the utilities earn a double-digit rate of return on transmission infrastructure. So they are very incentivized to build out transmission infrastructure. It gets them a lot of profit. And meanwhile, back in 2018 and in other years, we have found that energy efficiency and distributed solar have actually canceled billions in planned CAISO transmission projects over the past few years. PV Magazine had a good article, as well as Utility Dive, about how $2.6 billion was saved in 2018 due to the prevalence of more distributed generation in certain regions of the state. We're looking at anywhere from $3 or more for every dollar that's put into rate base. Cost ratepayers another $3 for transmission infrastructure. So the utilities really want to build out this transmission. It's what makes them their profits. It's what they are focused on. And they really don't like rooftop solar or distributed generation because it helps reduce the need for transmission, which means it cuts into their profits. Just to go into some of the details about this, just in the past 5 years, this is from the CPUC's own report, we are looking at a transmission rate base of over $19 billion. And you can see that the percentage change in just a few short years is pretty dramatic. And especially at PG&E's, you can see they have a 66% increase in transmission rate base over the past 5 years. And then the total transmission rate base increasing at 45%. Those are pretty alarming increases in the transmission revenue requirements that we are all paying for, plus the 10% rate of return. Not only that, but transmission costs, I would argue, have been runaway costs over the past couple of years in the California rate base. When you get some of these actual projects, the cost overruns are egregious and worthy of lawsuits in and of themselves as someone who came from the construction world. When you're looking at projects like the Tehachapi Renewable Transmission Project going from $1.7 billion to $3 billion, that is a ridiculous cost overrun that ratepayers are paying for and the utilities are profiting on. Not only that, but the CAISO approved projects are a smaller percentage of the overall transmission projects that are approved. PG&E, the utilities are all doing self-approved projects, and they've all increased at an alarming rate as well. And when you talk about transmission, FERC approved some of the transmission rate base at the federal level. The CAISO approved some of the state level ones, but these self-approved projects have no state or federal review on either the need or the cost for these projects. That is a really staggering finding, in my opinion, that is not being talked about enough when we talk about cost shifting, on whether or not any of these projects are actually needed and whether these costs are really warranted, especially when we're looking at $3 billion in cost overruns for one project. Now let's head back to wildfire mitigation. So after the utilities have helped burn down and black out our state, they are now spending roughly $3. We're spending roughly $3 a month to pay for AB 1054's wildfire mitigation costs. Not only that, but the IOUs are spending billions on grid hardening expenditures. Now, AB 1054 does exclude the first $5 billion of direct wildfire mitigation costs from earning a return on equity, so that the utilities are not profiting off of the full amount of the wildfire mitigation costs. However, if you go and look at the wildfire revenue requirements with the utilities over the next 10 years, we're looking at a baseline scenario of $20 billion for PG&E, almost $15 billion for Edison, and almost $4 billion for SDG&E. So this is only $5 billion, and we're looking at more like a $40 billion expenditure in wildfire mitigation costs over the next 9 years. The utilities get to make profit on all of that. And this is not even talking about what's likely to happen, in my view, is the high wildfire scenario as we come into another fire season and a year of what's looking like severe drought. This is incremental revenue requirement, by the way. This is added expenditures on top of normal operations. So these wildfire revenue requirements are only going to increase over time, and the utilities are continuing to profit off of those. Okay, but that's the utilities and the regulators keep saying, well, we need all of this, we need to make sure, and let's just forget about all of the things that happened in the past. That's what I constantly get told in the legislature anyway. We are also dealing with the aftermath of all of the utility negligence from infrastructure, with PSPS events continuing across California. This is an example, this photo is an example of one PSPS event in PG&E in October of 2019. We had customers losing power for averaging 1 to 3 days, but some in Northern California lost power for as many as 5 to 7 days. That is absolutely unacceptable. We have backup diesel generators flying off the store shelves. We have people in wheelchairs sleeping in their chairs because they couldn't have their actual medical equipment be powered by electricity during these outages. Manhattan Institute did a study on the value of lost load from public safety power shutoffs that are instituted for wildfire mitigation purposes, and estimates that outages cost customers anywhere from $160 to $320 per day. This is a free insurance policy for utilities and their shareholders that's being paid for on the backs of ratepayers. This is absolutely unacceptable, and this is a cost shift that no one is talking about enough in the legislature or at the CPUC. And finally, we come to the record profits that all of the utilities seem to be earning during a global pandemic, no less. The return on equity is absolutely astounding. We're looking at over 10% rate of return, and it's actually way higher than any of the other utilities in the country. They've argued that it's necessary because of the higher risk of investment. I say that that's a load of crap. And finally, we come to the arguments that the utilities keep making. There's a lot of hypocrisy and gaslighting happening in the legislature and the Public Utilities Commission. The utilities are arguing that only they can build safe and reliable infrastructure, completely ignoring their own safety records, completely ignoring all the devastation that they have caused over the past few years. Gaslighting when it comes to public power and allowing for CCAs to proliferate and do a better job than the utilities. We have pure regulatory capture happening at the CPUC, where the regulators seem to believe all of this gaslighting hypocrisy that the utilities continue to spread. And not only that, how dare they exploit systemic injustices like race and equity and continue to talk about how they care about poor people and environmental justice when they are the reason we have so many environmental injustices in this state. And finally, the biggest gaslighting statement of all is that DERs are cost shifting. Cost shifting is happening because of the utilities, not because of rooftop solar. It's really unfortunate where we're at today, where they are using solar as a scapegoat to shield their own failures. And Shalonda Baker does a really good job in her book, Revolutionary Power. I encourage others to read it. articulating exactly the utility playbook on how they are trying to maintain their own profits, and doing that through the use of gaslighting hypocrisy like cost shifting. And so I will just leave you with this as we go on to the next speaker. After all of this, who is really responsible for cost shifting? Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Our next speaker is Rosana Francescato. Thank you. Sorry. She is a communications director of Clean Coalition. She is leading the transmission access charges campaign, which is to fix this massive market distortion that unfairly disadvantages clean local energy. Previously, she's been communications director or managing editor for several other green companies or publications, and written extensively on clean energy. She's going to talk about fixing the real cost shift, transmission costs in California. So Rosanna, you want to take over the screen?
All right, thank you. Okay, let me just get my slides up here. Great, can you see my slides? All right, I'll assume you can. So hi everyone. Yes. Great, thanks. And Jose and Susan, thank you so much for having me on your webinar today. As Jose mentioned, I'm Rosana Francescato, Communications Director with the Clean Coalition, and I'm also leading the Transmission Access Charges campaign to fix a massive market distortion in California. So I want to just talk a little bit about the Clean Coalition and who we are, as this is directly related to our discussion today. The Clean Coalition is a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and a modern grid. Our endgame vision is that we will get to 100% renewable energy within the next 2 decades. And at the Clean Coalition, we're focused on the 25% of that endgame that we believe needs to come from local renewable sources. Local means you're interconnected within the distribution grid, where people live and work, and you're facilitating resilience, which is possible because you're avoiding any dependence on transmission lines, and long transmission lines are inherently not resilient. Now, if we get to 25% local renewable energy, we can build a large amount of resilience for critical community facilities and for a lot of the rest of the community as well. But we'll still need to get about 75% of our energy from remote sources. And these numbers can vary from place to place, but overall it's about 75%. So the Clean Coalition does believe that there is a very important role for transmission. We will need that for that 75%. But the transmission system is incredibly expensive, so we have to get it right. We have to invest our dollars in a really intelligent way, and we also have to allocate the cost of transmission accurately and sensibly. Otherwise, we distort the market and we create cost shifts like the one we have now, which I'm going to get into. We need to ensure that we're not stealing value from local renewables to ensure that we get to that 25% and that we don't subsidize transmission interconnected energy and end up with too much of it. So as Ali touched on, transmission costs are absolutely out of control throughout the country. They're the fastest growing component of electricity bills in California, where transmission already costs about the same as the energy itself. And soon it could cost more to move energy around than to generate it. And this is partly because of how the market is designed. Ali talked about this too. Transmission is guaranteed a return on equity of 12%. Now, there's no other investment where you can get a 12% guaranteed return on equity. This business model made some sense when, one, all energy was generated remotely, and two, we needed the utilities to build out our transmission system. But the situation today is very different, and we need a new utility business model. So this outdated model with a guaranteed ROE creates massive market distortions and conflicts of interest, which steal value from local generation, hurt ratepayers, and also preempt energy resilience, which we need so much these days. And one of these market distortions is the erroneous metering and assessment of transmission access charges, or TAC, in California's investor-owned utility territories. So this is the real cost shift happening in California, in addition, of course, to the wildfire liabilities. And I just want to mention quickly that transmission costs are much higher than they seem, because when you add operations and maintenance, plus that ROE, transmission costs go up 10 times beyond their initial capital costs. And these costs are borne by ratepayers. I won't get into all the details here, but you can look at the slides later, which will be posted for you. So how do we avoid these huge costs? It turns out that to optimize the grid for ratepayer savings, you need a lot of local renewables and energy storage. And Southern California Edison, a large utility, did some analysis on this a few years back, and they found that if you properly locate 4 gigawatts of local solar, you could preempt $2.2 billion in new transmission infrastructure investments just in their service territory. And remember, that's about $20 billion in ratepayer savings when you consider the O&M. So that was a study by a major utility, and their findings were actually contrary to their own self-interest, but that's the reality. And this is not just theoretical, as Ellie touched on, and this bears repeating. Already in CAISO's 2017 to 2018 planning process, they deferred $2.6 billion in planned transmission spending. And that was in large part because of increased deployment of local renewables as well as increased energy efficiency. Meanwhile, in 2021, utilities are charging ratepayers $4 billion in transmission costs. And this is a 66% increase over 2016 in PG&E territory alone. And utilities are also charging California ratepayers $5 billion in wildfire liability expenses. So you can see that these are the real cost shifts. Another recent study that you may have heard of by Vibrant Clean Energy backs up the SCE findings and also adds a lot to them. And this study found that if we deployed enough large solar and wind farms to decrease CO2 emissions by 95% by 2050, Americans would pay $385 billion more for power over the next 30 years. So that's if we just focused on remote energy generation. However, if we scale up local solar and storage in addition to and in close coordination with utility scale renewables, we can achieve the same clean energy goals while saving $473 billion. So this shows how local solar plus storage can save huge amounts of money, and that's regardless of who's deploying them. So there's no cost shift involved there. So transmission costs to ratepayers are huge and growing. And in California, we have a huge market distortion in the way transmission access charges, or TAC, are metered and assessed. And this means that California ratepayers are paying more than they should for the transmission system, and local renewable energy projects are disincentivized. And as I mentioned, this is the real cost shift happening in California, but it's one you don't hear about much. So here you see an illustration of the distribution grid and the transmission grid. And TAC are the usage fees for the transmission grid for both the high voltage lines and low voltage lines of the transmission section here. And in California's investor-owned utility service territories, these fees are being metered and assessed incorrectly at the customer meter, as is shown here. And that means you can't tell whether that energy came from the solar rooftop next door or from a power plant 1,000 miles away. They're treated exactly the same, regardless of the fact that the remote energy used the transmission grid and the locally generated energy did not use it at all. Now, in municipal utility service territories, TAC are being metered and assessed correctly at the substations between the high voltage to low voltage transmission lines and the low voltage transmission lines to the distribution grid. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel to do this correctly. We do need to change the utility business model, as we've talked about, but we can fix TAC even before doing that. The way that TAC are currently being assessed in IOU service territories, which means in most of California, just doesn't make sense. It's like paying extra shipping and handling fees for something you picked up next door, or paying a toll for the Golden Gate Bridge if you pull into your driveway at home. This is clearly where the actual cost shift is happening. So we have to fix this. And we have to fix it not only because ratepayers are paying these costs, which we are, but also because TAC distorts the market by making remote generation look a lot cheaper than it is. And 3 cents per kilowatt hour is being stolen from local renewables, which makes them look more expensive. So these charts show how that's happening. You know, people talk a lot about economies of scale of utility scale solar compared to rooftop solar. And in the chart on the left, you can see how when we ignore these transmission costs and they're hidden, remote generation in fact does look cheaper. But when you transport that energy over the transmission grid, you have those additional shipping and handling costs associated with transmission, and that comes to that 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So an important note is that since this cost is socialized to ratepayers, when load serving entities like the investor-owned utilities and CCAs procure energy, they ignore that cost and they buy the energy that looks cheaper for them, but guess what? It's more expensive for all of us. So we need to make these costs actually be shown and included. And you can see here in the chart on the right, when we fix the TAC distortion and make these costs visible, then local renewables look a lot more cost effective and can in fact even be cheaper. So since transmission costs are increasing rapidly, of course, TAC are also increasing. And in 20 years, they're expected to be at 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's where we get the levelized cost of TAC at 3 cents. And that is about 50% of the average wholesale cost of electricity in California. So that's huge. The Clean Coalition did a deep analysis on this, and we found that if you fix the TAC market distortion, we'll end up with a lot more local renewables over the next 20 years. If we continued with business as usual, as you can see in this top line, we'd have something like 12% of our energy coming from local renewables. But if we fix TAC, we can get that to 30%, maybe over 30%, and that will save Californians over $60 billion over 20 years. Plus, of course, we're going to have a lot better outcomes for local renewables. So how do we fix TAC? Our proposed reform is simple. Only charge transmission fees for energy that's delivered through the transmission system. Makes sense, right? And have procurement reflect both the energy purchase price and the delivery charges. There's a lot of support for this. We've gotten over 85 organizations to sign on to our campaign so far. And this has taken time. We went through a lengthy stakeholder process with CAISO a few years ago, and CAISO agreed that TAC reform is needed, but they said it's an interagency issue and the CPUC needs to get involved. We have talked to CPUC staff. They've also agreed that the issue should be taken up, but they don't really have the right proceeding to put it in. So we need legislation to compel both CAISO and the CPUC to take action. We have draft legislation that's been approved by the Legislative Council, and various California state legislators are considering it. As Ali mentioned, there have been a lot of distractions in the legislature the last couple of years, so it's been challenging. And another challenge is that TAC reform can seem like an obscure issue. And of course, legislators are worried that they'll be confronted with the cost shift argument, which we know is bogus, but which keeps coming up as we've seen. So, luckily more people are starting to see the importance of making this fix. And if you want to sign your organization on to support this campaign, just to say you're supporting it, you don't have to do anything else. There's a link here and I'll send it out later too. So a few final thoughts. The real cost shift, as we have seen, is excessive transmission spending. Our current outdated system is what is shifting costs. And our proposed TAC reform will help fix that existing cost shift and lower costs for all ratepayers. So TAC reform is one necessary piece of the puzzle to accelerate and facilitate local renewables and get all of their benefits. We do also need to fix our outdated utility business model, which perversely incentivizes transmission build out over local renewables. And we need to incentivize utilities to support rather than fight local solar. And one effective way to do this would be to divest utilities of their transmission assets. I have here a link to an article that we wrote about that, which you can take a look at. So overall, we need to fix the real cost shift. We need to implement the policies and market fixes that will help deploy more renewables and renewables-driven community microgrids so we can meet our clean energy goals and get the energy resilience we need, as well as the many other benefits of local renewables. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosana. I hope that people have a much better understanding of the nature of the grid and the realities of cost shift from listening to an expert. Our next speaker, I have to share my screen to show you something. Let me do that. Our next speaker is Dave Rosenfeld. who's the executive director of the Solar Rights Alliance. He's been a community organizer for over 20 years. He is he's been a very successful community organizer in Oregon, where he led several successful ballot measures and large public interest organizations. He's going to tell us how to save California solar now that we understand the reality of the cost shift, the bogus cost shift. So I will let Dave take over. Dave, you can show your screen.
Okay. Get that going. All right. Just to get a gut check, Jose, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Very good. Okay. Thanks to the Center for Community Energy for hosting this. And thank you all for being here and your interest in this incredibly important issue. I'm Dave Rosenfeld, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we need to do. And so just quickly about Solar Rights Alliance, that's the organization I run. We are the California Association of Solar Users. We believe everyone has the right to make energy from the sun without unreasonable interference by the utility. We are a grassroots organization. We've only been around about 3 years. That's only because we just crossed the 1 million solar rooftop mark about a year ago, 2 years ago. And it's time for solar users, make sure that that voice is heard. And we welcome, obviously, people that don't have solar but support solar or want it someday. This is just a little bit about our board of directors, which is basically regular people who have solar and want to fight to make sure that everybody else can get it too. All right. I wanted to just build on one or two things and just understand the politics of what's going on here. So the facts are obviously really clear. And so you're kind of wondering, okay, like, why is this so hard? And I think some of you might be saying, like, okay, maybe it's hard because the utilities have a lot of power, and so that's the end of it. That's totally true. But I think it's also important to understand that the utilities are really smart, and they know that if they're the only ones carrying the water on this kind of bogus cost shift argument, that it would get a lot less traction. And so the important thing to understand is that there's an echo chamber. And this has been very cleverly crafted by a bunch of willing partners. And I've listed on the screen who some of those partners are. And so whether it's NRDC or TURN or the Berkeley Haas School of Business / Severin Bornstein, E3 Consulting, the CPUC Public Advocate, Next 10. If you're think of yourself as if you're a legislator or you're a legislator's staff person, or you're on the CPUC or as a CPUC staff person, or the governor, or any other kind of, or a reporter, or any other member of kind of like the intelligentsia, and you don't know much about this issue, and you're seeing just all kinds of stuff that seems credible, seems source, seems to come from seems kind of like academic-y, and it's coming from like a respected environmental group like NRDC or from a Berkeley Research Institute, you might buy into it too. And then if you're a legislator and you're already taking a ton of money from the utilities, or you want to take a ton of money from the utilities, or from some of the utilities allies, like for example, the IBEW, then this gives you kind of cover, because now you have an equity argument to make that gives you the ability to then cast a vote for the utilities that otherwise you might not be able to get away with. So we should not underscore just how damaging the echo chamber is. And the important thing to understand about the echo chamber is that they all basically use the same methodology tricks to get to their cost shift numbers. And, Ali and Rosana, walked through why the cost shift is bogus. But you may be wondering, okay, well then how do they get away with making the claim? And like how do, one of the popular numbers that gets bandied about right now is that rooftop solar and batteries, and rooftop solar is responsible for shifting $2 to $3 billion a year in grid costs over to other ratepayers. And you go, well, how the heck do they get those numbers? And the thing to understand is just that it's very consistent, the methodology that they use. And so I'm not going to go through everything that's on this slide, but just to give you an example of the first thing is almost to an echo chamber member, they almost all of them, when they do their math, they count the solar that's consumed at home or at a business or at the school or at the church or wherever their solar is they count that solar that's consumed on site as a cost to other ratepayers. This is a very common thing that we see in their math. And of course, that if you're thinking, is that must be the same as like if you grow your own vegetables, you're somehow responsible for raising prices on vegetables at Safeway, you would be right. That is the exact analogy. And so you might be then going like, how the heck do they even justify that to themselves? And the way that they do that is by, in their world, fixed costs are always fixed today and evermore. And of course, we know, and as you've seen Rosana and Ali point out, fixed costs are not actually that fixed. In fact, they're dynamic. And we know that in 2018 alone, because of rooftop solar and energy efficiency, CAISO canceled 20 massive transmission projects, and that saved the state that year $2.6 billion. There's a lever going on. And when you do more local energy, and when less people use energy from the grid, then the costs of maintaining and building out the grid go down in real time. But they don't see that. So they just go, if I'm not buying from the utility today, I'm costing people today money. And so there's similar methodology tricks that they basically all use, but it makes it seem academic. And that's one reason why this is just so hard and why we're not getting more traction in the work that we're doing. So then just to pivot to like, what do we want? And so I think it's kind of good to just kind of lay out like, why do we need more rooftop solar and storage? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is a friendly crowd, but just for posterity's sake, and also so that you can make these arguments in your own worlds, the obvious thing is that people ought to have more control over their energy bills and shouldn't have to choose between paying their utility bill and buying groceries. And we've got a technology that's on its way to essentially making energy low cost or free. And we should be figuring out how to get that into the hands of millions of people, because we shouldn't assume, like we've been kind of assuming for the last 100 years that this is just the way things are. It doesn't have to be that way. But of course, power outages is the other real reason why we need more of this. There's only really one solution to power outages from a consumer perspective, and that's local solar and battery storage. And there just is no other way. And the state has no other plan. And, I think has been pointed out, when we increase local solar and battery storage, the benefits don't just accrue to the lucky folks who have the solar and the battery on site, but we can stitch these together into microgrids and virtual power plants and community solar and all these other kinds of things. And so we need that, and we need a hell of a lot more of it if we're going to really be able to get our arms around the annual rolling power outages that we're dealing with. Of course, then we're not going to be able to get to 100% clean, or we're certainly not going to do it very well if we don't scale up rooftop solar and storage, because the state's already said we're going to need to triple every single form of wind and solar and other forms of renewables. You saw that in the previous slide. If we don't do the rooftop, then not only is the whole thing going to be more expensive, but we're going to be eating up valuable open space, sacred lands that are right now in the hands of native tribes. And we may not even get there, just because at some point we're going to have to make some hard choices and we may not want to use up more land. So it just makes a lot of sense to scale up for that reason. And then of course, finally, it's just cheaper for everybody, whether they have the solar or not. And you've already seen, I'm just reiterating some of the studies that you've already seen our previous presenters go through, but this is just good for everybody, whether or not you have the product or not. So of course, the threat is the utilities want to double the cost of going solar so that nobody else will go. And I should just say here, 15 years ago, when the Million Solar Roofs Initiative was launched, there were only 20,000 solar systems in the state. And the only people that you could only get solar if you were rich or you were super duper committed and pretty technical, kind of a DIYer. And today, 15 years later, there's over 1 million now solar systems. And importantly, just under half of all solar is going into working class and middle class neighborhoods. This is huge. I mean, just think of where we are today. And then even better is that of the 1 million solar rooftops, 15% of them, so 150,000 of those systems, are serving care customers, those who are on discounted electricity rates. So think of how far we've traveled in 15 years, and then think about the trajectory of other technologies that have changed the world, whether you like them or not: cars, televisions, cell phones, and just the pace that those technologies became something that was just only for the rich to something that was ubiquitous. Cell phones now are in the hands of 14-year-olds in third world countries. This is where rooftop solar and solar in general is going. We see, and we can make that happen more quickly and get this into the hands of millions of working class communities in a few short years if we keep the trajectory going. The utilities see that, So they're trying to basically burn rooftop solar to the ground just as it's getting into the hands of millions of working class people. And that's what this is all about. So here's what they proposed to the CPUC. And this is more or less what it is. The first, there's three things. One, they want to tax solar. They call it a fee or a fixed charge or a grid access charge. Doesn't matter. Depending on the territory you're in and the type of system you have, these are the kinds of charges that you'd be seeing if you wanted to go solar. So that's the first thing they want to do. This alone would basically tank the market, but it gets better because then they also want to slash the net metering credit by 80%. That's the credit that solar users get for sharing the extra energy with the neighbors. And they want to slash that credit by 80% because the utilities are a monopoly and they hate the fact that they have to pay people for their energy. The utilities like to go, no, you pay me, I don't pay you. So that's what this is about. And then the final thing that they proposed is that unused solar credits expire at the end of each month rather than how it works right now, which is it expires at the end of each year. Well, of course, since most of the solar production is happening in the spring and summer months, if that expires at the end of every month, then it doesn't help buy down your rates in the wintertime. And of course, all three things taken together basically double the cost of going solar and would absolutely put this out of the hands of working class Californians, both single family and multifamily, and also schools, businesses, farms, and all the other institutions that also are taking advantage of solar. So where's the battlefield in all of this? The battlefield until a few weeks ago was at the California Public Utilities Commission. This is 5 people who are appointed by the governor, and they have been in the middle of a year-long proceeding. This is the number of the proceeding, and the objective is that by the end of the year, the CPUC intends to adjust the net metering program. I guess maybe I should just pause for a moment and just say net metering is the program that allows solar users to share the extra energy that they make with their neighbors, literally with the neighborhood, and get a bill credit for that extra energy that is more or less equivalent to what we call the retail rate. So the utility basically buys some electricity from you, electricity they spent no money making and virtually no money transporting. And then they turn around and sell it to the neighbor at the same exact price, again, for electricity they spent no money making and virtually no money transporting. And so the CPUC is going to take this issue up, and they are being lobbied very heavily by the utilities and the echo chamber to do what I showed you in the previous slide. So that's the deal there, but then utilities are never content to just fight the battle in one forum. They want to fight the battle in every forum that they can. So you've been hearing about AB 1139, which is a bill in the state legislature as we speak. For all I know, it's getting discussed right now. And that bill more or less would do exactly what the utilities want to do at the CPUC, but basically take care of it through the legislature. And the bill is it's become technical, but more or less what it is a bullying tactic to basically signal to the CPUC, do what the utilities have proposed to you, to rooftop solar. And that's more or less what the bill is. The only other thing I'll say about the bill right now, and maybe we can gather this in the Q&A, is the bill started out being incredibly transparent about what the intentions were, because it literally said the CPUC, the default position for the CPUC is going to be the utility proposal. They've discovered, the utilities, that when you're transparent about what your intentions are, the public rises up. And so last Friday, they amended the bill to be more opaque, but the net impact is basically the same. Just goes to show that the bad guys can only really actually operate in the shadows because they're so bad and the public is so out of step that they avoid that. So obviously Governor Newsom is a big deal in all of this. We can talk about that later. So I just wanted to have this here just to make sure we haven't forgotten about the governor. But the battlefield for now is in these two forums, and frankly, literally right now here. If we can't kill AB 1139, then this whole thing is toast. The good news is the public is totally with us. I mean, once you get out of the bubble, and I would include this forum as a bubble, it's intuitive to the vast majority of the public. And this, by the way, there's almost no difference between Democrats and Republicans and those who are other affiliations on these issues. Most people want the state to do more to encourage solar. Most support net metering. Even when you give them the opposition arguments, the cost shift argument without any refutation, you make the argument like the opposition would make it, people stay with us. And then there's just like a ton of organizations, many of whom are on this call, that are, fighting. So this is like an awesome coalition. So our goals, big picture, is to strengthen, don't weaken net metering, keep solar growing, 150,000 new installations a year, half of which are right now going into working and middle class neighborhoods. That's number one. Number two, we want to make solar even more affordable for working class people and renters especially. There's a bunch of things we can do within net metering to make it stronger so that we accelerate the pace of adoption in working class neighborhoods and also rentals. And then there's a bunch of things we can do outside of net metering to layer on top to leverage net metering so that we can accelerate the pace and really turn this into something just like cell phones have become. And then the final thing is to incentivize solar power batteries so that by the time we get to 2030, if not sooner, all solar is paired with a battery for all the reasons that I think we've heard about. So the to-do list is we got to defeat AB 1139. If we don't defeat AB 1139, then anything else that we want to do, pretty much anything related to energy justice is going to be very, very, very hard to do. And then we got to go back, we got to win a strong net metering policy of the CPUC. And I should have added a third thing, which is then utility reform, just like we were talking about. And there's like a whole bunch of other things that we got to do to kind of press the advantage if we can succeed in doing this. We are, as I think people know, we're in the middle of a really robust campaign to stop AB 1139. We have called it the utility profit grab. The upper left-hand corner is a photo of the rally that we did 2 weeks ago at the state capitol. Over 300 people participated in that rally. We had amazing speakers that came in from around the state. Down below is Bob, the Monopoly Man, is going on tour. So he's been doing a bunch of stops in San Diego in front of various places, and we're getting a lot of media attention in doing that. I think it's been mentioned, Rosana mentioned, there's a lot of great groups. This is just a snapshot of the organizations that have stood up and are sharing their voice and their political clout to stop AB 1139. I think we're almost absolutely certain that at least 4,000 people have called their legislators in the last 2 weeks to oppose AB 1139. It truly is just an amazing example of people rising up. And then in terms of what you're thinking, like, how do you kind of plug in to this effort? I would invite you to join the Save California Solar campaign. The easiest path of entry is just to take the action that I have here on the page. Because if you do that, you'll get a chance to email your legislators and make a phone call to your legislators right now. If you haven't already done that, you can customize all this stuff. We give you a form thing because we like to make it easy, but you can customize this. But that's a way, if you do that, you get on our list. And so this way we can keep you in touch with all the other things that we're going to need to do. And then obviously just share the heck out of that action. I assume we'll send this out after the call. So if you're not writing this down quick enough, we'll get it to you. And then the second step is just to fight the cost shift narrative, because it does dominate the debate and we need a lot of smart people to basically fight back on it. So visiting with your legislator, helping to engage in the media. When you see a crappy article, get a letter to the editor. And if you're dialed into kind of like any aspect of the intelligentsia and academia, engage. If you're on social media, engage. Like, this is actually a street fight. It's kind of to think about something as wonky as this is a street fight, but it kind of is. It's a little bit of a knife fight. And because of the third-party validators that the utilities have, we need you, all you smart people, to like get very, very, very public with lawmakers staffs, with media, with other smart people, out on the interwebs, so that we can fight that fight. So it's this thing and this thing. And then of course, email me and we can get you on the Save California Solar distribution list. We've got a toolkit with additional ideas of ways that you can plug in and go for that. And then of course, I love that cartoon that I think it was either Ali or Rosana did. So I'm going to end with that and I am done.
Oh, thank you, Dave. That's inspiring as well as informative. I hope everybody takes Dave's suggestions and becomes active in this. I will now open it for questions. I will remind everybody, I can only see questions that you put in the Q&A, not in the chat. So I'll invite all of our speakers to appear and unmute themselves, and I'll start with the questions in the Q&A. And the first one is very technical, so I'm going to summarize it. Peter Esposito asks about the comparison between gas utilities and transmission utilities. I think the point is that apparently gas utilities have been separated from generation utilities. And he suggests that because of that, they've been using new technology and to minimize their costs, because they're not they do not have the perverse incentives that the transmission utilities do. And he suggests that this suggests that the utilities have to be separated from the generation business. And I think that's that's part of the thing that Clean Coalition is working on. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, and I'll put the link to the article in the chat. But yeah, divesting the utilities of their transmission assets would be a really great way to remove the conflict of interest that they currently have with distributed energy resources and make them distribution system operators. We need the distribution system to be managed at a more granular level anyway, and that would be something they could do. Obviously, they're not going to like changing their current business model, which is working really well for them right now, any more than they're going to like changing all these other things. But I think that they know that the writing is on the wall and that things are going to have to change. So rather than get into all that, let me find that link and drop it in the chat. I encourage people to take a look at that article.
Okay. Tom Lynn asks, has anybody done a point-by-point rebuttal to the studies that are on this topic? Dave, I thought you said that somebody was working on that.
Yeah, I mean, the AB 1139 fact sheet, which I'll drop in the chat in a moment, kind of touches on some of the top line rebuttals. And so I'll drop that in. In terms of a point by point, yes, I'm working on it. There's other people like Bill Powers, who's been working on this. If people know who he is. There's kind of like, and then there's like bits and pieces of the point by point that kind of exist out there. There has not been a point by point that kind of links together the whole echo chamber. And so I'm kind of like, I've been working on a piece like that for the last month. I hope to get something out, but I've also been working on it for the last month because we're running this campaign. So don't wait for me, go do it yourself, but I am also working on it too. And this is clearly something we need. But I would say, I think it is actually relatively simple. It's like those 3 or 4 methodology tricks that they use. And what we need to do is just kind of itemize who uses each of those tricks and where do they use it. And so that's where it's at. It's clearly sorely needed as a tool for us in this community to be able to like really engage at that academic level. So absolutely, it's out there. We got to work on it. And we might just have to crowdsource our way into it.
Okay. Chad Bear points out that he has a solar system that was installed some years ago. He asks if a plan to reach renewable energy in 2 decades is going to have to include some plan to replace older solar arrays. Does anybody have any thoughts on how that's going to happen?
I can take that one. I think one of the great things about distributed energy resources is that the technologies are more flexible and can be replaced quicker, unlike a large centralized power plant. And so it's not so much a stranded investment, but when it reaches the end of its useful life, you can install a new solar system or a new battery. Same thing with microgrids. They have different components that can be replaced when new technologies come out or the end of their useful life is reached. And so having shorter lifespans for some of these technologies is actually a good thing because it allows us to actually modernize it quicker and adapt with the times and the changes. So I think that actually works in our favor, and hopefully in 10 years or whenever your system does reach the end of its useful life, we have even more efficient panels. Maybe they look nicer or something like that, where you're able to replace them and upgrade the technology. Similarly to the way we talk with a cell phone analogy, upgrading to the newest iPhone when the new one comes out.
And I'm fully expecting my panels to last a lot longer than 20 years. They will keep generating energy. So, when we're talking about panels on people's roofs, they will also last longer than that.
Okay, here's an important one. Sheen Frame brings up the question, what about the argument that the labor unions are making that protecting rooftop solar jobs is protecting corporate solar and their low-paying non-union jobs? there was an opposition to the rooftop solar because they're largely, or at least partially, non-union.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole comment about big corporate solar is kind of hilarious, considering the utilities are much larger than any corporation that develops solar or battery storage in this state or in general. And I would say that the low paying jobs, that's not true. I think there's a lot of great paying jobs that are both union and non-union in the solar industry. So I think that that's quite frankly just not true. Dave, I don't know if you want to add more to that.
Yeah, I think the thing, you know, the AB 1139 author has kind of gone out and said, this is basically taking on Elon Musk, who basically runs solar in California. Here's the fact. The vast majority, I forget if it's 60% or if it's 70%, but it's something like that, of all the solar that's installed in California is done by about 400 small and medium-sized businesses that are not the big ones. Mom and pops, sometimes a little bigger than mom and pops, you know, so like I say, small and medium-sized businesses. Sunrun, which has the biggest share of the market, is only like 13% of all solar. So that's not nothing, obviously, but this is very much a cottage industry, and it grew that way. And it's actually kind of unique, you know, when we look at solar in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. And it's like 60,000 jobs. They, you know, most of them are not union. They are pretty well paying by any kind of relative standard, and they are a pathway to the middle class. They're like a classic. I ran a ballot measure, I think you saw in my bio, on bringing more career technical education back to our high schools and getting off this like tragic path that, you know, the American education system got on about 20 years ago, where everybody had to go to a 4-year college or else you were just a burnout, you know, who was just stuck in the dregs of society. Like totally horrible decision we made. We eviscerated career technical education as a result. So when we were running that measure and bringing back CTE, one of the things we were talking, like one of the big things when we were talking about what's the most promising CTE, career technical education, was obviously coding and that kind of thing. And the other thing was renewable energy. And the most renewable energy jobs is, you know, getting on the rooftops, getting into the homes and retrofitting America to be, you know, part of the clean energy revolution. And so then when it kind of gets to like, okay, well, why is IBEW so, you know, have such a problem with this? Like, you know, and I have to say, I think it's two things. One is it's hard to unionize 500 small businesses, even under the most pro-labor rules, you know, like that's just a fact of the market. And so it's just easier to unionize PG&E and SDG&E because it's just one or two. And they know that even if they unionize Tesla and Sunrun, they wouldn't get most of the market. And what are you going to do? You're going to put those small businesses out of business and turn them into a monopoly? Like it's just, there's no logic to it. Number one. Number two, let's remember that there is some cases where, like, let's think of the United Auto Workers, you know, for decades, they lobbied to kill clean car standards on behalf of General Electric. The Coal Miners Union lobbied for decades on behalf of the coal mining companies to kill climate change legislation. There are some segments of labor that just make a strategic decision that more profits for the employer is better for them, and thus they just strategically align. That's unfortunate. It's not impugning organized labor as a whole. It's just to say that sometimes trade unions will do that, and I think that's just what's going on here.
Okay, we're just about running out of time. I think there's a lot more interesting questions. I'm going to save the Q&A and ask the panelists to answer these questions in writing, and we'll try to post that in some way on our website, if that's okay with everybody. I just want to thank everyone and bring up one last screen to announce our upcoming webinars. This is the first of a series of webinars about energy efficiency and the green economy. So I want to invite everyone to sign up for our upcoming webinars, which will cover electric vehicles, heat pump heating, heat pump water heaters, and induction cooking. The theme is the future economy, which will be much more efficient. And to follow the line of thinking that we've described here, in the future, we won't need as much energy. And this is something that the utilities are going to have to face up to. The economy of the future will use energy differently. In some ways, we'll use more electricity as we electrify buildings and electrify transportation, but in some ways, we'll use less electricity as we become more efficient. So there has to be a thoughtful adaptation of how electricity and how energy in general is used. And we're going to continue to explore that in our upcoming webinars. So I invite everyone to log into centerforcommunityenergy.org and register for the upcoming webinars. I'd like to thank our speakers for very insightful presentations. I hope everyone is much better educated about this cost shift bogus argument. And I thank the attendees very much for listening to this, and I hope they're much better educated, and I hope they become active. So thank you all, and thank our sponsor, Futures Unlimited. Thank you, everybody.
You.
Thank you.